For 11 days, the bald eagle stood in the same corner of the yard and stared at the fence. Not at the mountains beyond it, not at the sky, just the fence. He was 9 years old with a wingspan of 2 meters and 11 centimeters, and he had not opened his wings in 3 weeks. Every morning, the staff arrived at 6:45 to find him exactly where they had left him the night before. Same patch of bare dirt, same angle of the head. The food they placed 3 feet away went untouched until afternoon, and sometimes not at all. His blood work was clean. His feathers were intact. He was eating just enough to stay alive and nothing more. The staff called it a behavioral anomaly. The wildlife veterinarian called it a diagnostic puzzle. The retired search and rescue handler who showed up one Tuesday morning with a dented thermos and nowhere particular to be would later say he didn't call it anything at all. He just recognized it. The Rocky Mountain Wildlife Rehabilitation Center sits at 4,000 feet elevation in northern Colorado on 12 acres of mixed grassland and pine. Most animals come through heal and go back. Some stay longer than expected. And then there are the ones like Atlas who arrive already healed in the body and broken somewhere the instruments cannot reach. Atlas had been part of the center's conservation education program for 6 years before his injury. He had flown at more than 300 school visits and nature centers across 4 states. He was trained to glide from a handler's glove at distances of up to 40 meters and return on command. He was not a wild bird in the way that phrase is usually meant. He was a bird who had learned to exist between 2 worlds and who had built his entire life around that balance. The accident happened on a Tuesday in March at 6 in the morning before anyone at the center had arrived for the day. A section of storm netting above Atlas's outdoor enclosure had torn loose in the night wind and come down across the top of the space. Atlas had tried to fly through it. The impact fractured his right wing in 3 places. The center's veterinarian, Dr. Karen Osei, was there by 7:15. She stabilized the wing and began the 6-week process of immobilization and careful monitoring. By week 8, the bones had knit together cleanly. By week 10, the range of motion had returned to 94% of baseline. By week 12, Dr. Osei wrote in her notes that Atlas was, from a purely medical standpoint, ready to be assessed for return to flight activity. He was not ready. The first flight assessment was conducted in April by a certified raptor trainer named Joel Fitch, who had worked with birds of prey for over 20 years and drove 2 hours each way to consult on cases the center could not handle internally. Joel placed Atlas on the training perch at one end of the center's 40-meter flight corridor, walked to the other end and raised his glove. Atlas looked at him. He looked at the corridor. He looked at Joel again. He did not move. Joel waited 12 minutes before lowering his glove. They tried again the following week on the open grassland behind the main building. Joel placed fresh prey at 30 meters distance. A field mouse still warm. Atlas tracked it with his eyes. He shifted his weight from foot to foot 3 times. Then he went still. He did not fly. Joel collected the untouched mouse and drove home. The third attempt was Dr. Osei's idea. She set up a small speaker at 15 meters and played 11 minutes of recorded chick calls at low volume. Atlas turned his head toward the speaker. His feathers shifted slightly along the back of his neck. Then he turned away. Dr. Osei stopped the recording. She took off her glasses, the left arm held together with a strip of medical tape she had applied 4 months ago and not yet replaced, and she rubbed the bridge of her nose. She wrote 3 words in Atlas's file that afternoon: motivational collapse possible. A bald eagle without flight is a bald eagle without a self. Karen told this to the center's director, Margaret Lindstrom, while they stood at the fence watching Atlas stand in his corner. Margaret was 61 years old and had been running wildlife rehabilitation programs for 23 years. She had seen this before, she said. Not often. She told Karen they would give it 2 more months and reassess. She said it the way you say something when you already know the reassessment is going to be hard. Raymond Kowalski arrived at the center on the first Tuesday of May. He was 58 years old with a broad, weathered face and the particular quality of stillness that develops in people who have spent decades in high-alert environments and learned to keep the alertness internal. He had spent 22 years as a handler with the Jefferson County Search and Rescue Unit, working with 2 German Shepherds, first Beck, then Duke. Duke had died in January. Bone cancer diagnosed in October, gone by January 7th. Ray had taken the 3 days of bereavement leave the unit offered, returned to finish out the quarter, and filed his retirement paperwork. He told the Human Resources Coordinator that he had been planning to retire that year anyway, which was partly true. He did not say the other part. He had found out about the Rocky Mountain Wildlife Center through a neighbor who volunteered there on weekends. He called and asked if they needed help with anything. The coordinator said they always needed people to sit with the animals, just to be present, she said, to get them used to calm human energy. Ray said that sounded like something he could do. He drove 40 minutes and arrived with a dented steel thermos that had his unit's logo scratched almost completely off one side. He poured coffee into the lid and asked Margaret where he was most needed. She pointed him toward the eagle. He did not ask what was wrong with Atlas. He walked to the low wooden bench along the outer fence of the eagle's yard, approximately 3 meters from the mesh, and he sat down. He held the thermos lid in both hands and looked out at the grassland beyond the property. Atlas stood in his corner 8 meters away and did not look at him. Ray stayed for 2 hours that first morning. He finished his coffee. He refilled the lid once from the thermos. He did not approach the mesh. He did not speak. He simply sat in the same space, breathing the same morning air until it was time to drive home. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that. The third morning was gray with low clouds sitting on the hills to the west. Ray arrived at 7:15 the way he always did, poured his coffee and looked out at the grassland. Atlas stood in his corner and did not move. Nothing happened that morning or the next. But on the 4th day, when Dr. Osei came in at 7:30 for her morning check, Atlas was no longer in his corner. He had shifted to a patch of ground near the center of the yard, 2 meters closer to the bench, in a spot where he could see the grassland over the top of the mesh. It was the first time in 3 weeks that anyone had seen him choose a different position without being moved there by staff. She stood at the gate and looked at the eagle in his new location and looked at Ray sitting on the bench, and she did not say anything. She walked back to the main building and wrote 4 words in Atlas's daily log, voluntary positional change noted. Ray's routine was consistent in a way the staff began to notice. He arrived each morning at 7:15, never earlier and rarely later. He sat on the bench. He poured his coffee into the lid of the thermos, holding the thermos in his left hand, and turning the lid with his right until the thread caught a small private sequence of motions he performed every time without appearing to think about it. He drank slowly. He watched the grassland. He did not watch Atlas. On the 6th morning, something happened that none of the 3 people who witnessed it could quite describe accurately afterward. The morning was overcast, with a low ceiling of cloud that muffled the sounds from the highway 2 miles east. Ray poured his coffee. Atlas turned his head just enough to point his left eye directly at the bench. He held that position for 90 seconds. Then he looked away. Ray continued looking at the grassland, and the morning continued the way mornings do. Margaret, who had been watching from 20 meters away, said later that she had felt something shift. She said it the way people say things they know sound imprecise, and say them anyway, because precision would lose what they were trying to describe. On the 9th morning, Atlas walked to the inner fence line. He stopped at 90 centimeters from the mesh. He lowered his head. Ray sat still. He placed the thermos lid on the bench beside him, rested both hands on his knees, and looked at the grassland. 17 minutes passed. Atlas raised his head, turned away, and walked to the water station. He drank. It was the first time in 12 days he had drunk without being coaxed. The first feeding breakthrough came on day 14. Dr. Osei had been leaving Atlas's morning ration, 180 grams, of prepared trout, in a shallow tray near the inner fence line, 3 feet from the section closest to Ray's bench. Atlas ignored it for 2 hours. Then, while Ray was on the bench at 8:40, Atlas walked to the tray and ate everything in 11 minutes. He ate with his back to Ray. Karen was watching from the gate. She took off her glasses and held them in both hands and looked down at them for a moment. Then she put them back on and went to update the file. Atlas began leaving his corner earlier each morning. He moved around the yard differently now, not pacing, but looking. He tilted his head at the mesh at the gate at the post that held the feeding station, the way you look at something you are deciding what to do with. He began watching birds in the sky. For an eagle who had stopped wanting to fly, that was not nothing. On a Thursday, in early June day, 31 of Ray's visits, Dr. Osei and Joel Fitch set up a second flight assessment on the open grassland. They waited until 9 o'clock, 2 hours into Ray's morning visit. Ray agreed to stand at the far edge of the area near the tree line at 60 meters from Atlas's release point. He brought his thermos. Joel carried Atlas from the yard on the heavy leather glove and walked him to the starting point. Atlas stood on the glove and looked at the open space ahead of him. He looked at the trees. He stood still for 4 minutes and 12 seconds, which Joel counted because he had nothing else to do with his hands. Then Atlas spread his wings. The full span, 2 meters and 11 centimeters, caught the morning light and held it for 3 seconds. Then he flew. He covered 60 meters in 11 seconds. He landed on the wooden post 8 feet from where Ray was standing and folded his wings and looked at the man who had been sitting on the bench every morning for 31 days. Ray looked back. He did not raise his glove. He did not reach toward the bird. He stood with the thermos in his left hand, and the grassland was quiet around both of them. Joel, standing 60 meters back at the release point, said afterward that he didn't want to move. He said he felt like he would be interrupting something. He waited 4 minutes before walking toward them, which was long enough. In the weeks that followed, Atlas flew the corridor twice, then 3 times, then 5 times in a single session. His landing precision returned before his distance confidence did. He began flying above the tree line, circling once over the property before descending. Ray was present for most of these sessions, not as a training participant, but simply as the man on the bench, the fixed point around which everything else was being rebuilt. And then on a Friday afternoon in late June, the center received a phone call. It came from the Raptor Recovery Institute in Bozeman, Montana, a facility with a 180-meter flight corridor, a full-time behavioral specialist, and a 300-acre wilderness acclimation zone. The institute had heard about Atlas and wanted to offer him a place in their long-term resident program. Every specialist who reviewed the offer agreed it was the right thing for the bird. It was a better facility. It had more expertise. It had space this center could never give him. Margaret called Ray on a Sunday evening. She explained the situation and said the transfer would take place in approximately 3 weeks. Ray listened to everything. He told her it sounded like good news for the bird. He thanked her for calling. He set the phone down on the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment looking at it. His thermos was on the counter beside the phone where he always left it the night before. He picked it up and put it in its usual spot by the door. Then he went to bed. He kept coming every morning for the 3 weeks before the transfer. He did not tell Atlas anything. He sat on the bench, and he poured his coffee, and he watched the grassland, and the eagle flew over his head on mornings when the air was warm enough for thermals. The transport happened on a Tuesday. Atlas was crated by 7:30 and on his way north by 8. Ray stood near the loading area and watched the process. He did not ask to say goodbye to Atlas in any formal way. When the crate was loaded and the vehicle's door was closing, Atlas turned his head inside the crate, and the golden eye went briefly to the figure standing near the fence. It lasted less than a second. The door closed. Ray watched the vehicle pull out of the lot and turn north on the county road. Then he walked to the bench and sat down. He poured the last of the coffee from his thermos. He sat there for an hour, looking at the empty yard. The patch of bare dirt in the corner, the tray near the inner fence, the particular angle of morning light that came through the pine at the property's east edge and reached the bench at around 8:15. Ray sat in it until it moved past him. Then he drove home. 6 days passed. The yard was quiet in the mornings now. A great horned owl had been moved into the far enclosure. But owls are not morning animals, and the space where Atlas had stood held a particular silence that the staff moved around without discussing. Ray did not come. On the 7th morning, the phone rang. It was Dr. Priya Sandhu calling from Bozeman. She had spent 15 years working with raptors across North America and had read Atlas's file twice before his arrival. She told Ray what she was seeing. Atlas had been placed in a 12-meter acclimation enclosure standard protocol for new arrivals. The staff had put his food in the center of the space at 8 o'clock that first morning. By noon, it was untouched. She had gone back to Karen's intake notes to the section marked Environmental Factors Contributing to Recovery. Karen had written one sentence: daily presence of calm human figure at consistent time and location appeared to be primary stabilizing factor. Dr. Sandhu had underlined it. She asked Ray very directly if he would be willing to come to Bozeman. She said she wasn't certain it would help, but she was certain she wanted to try it before anything else. Ray was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When do you want me there?" He arrived 2 days later on a Thursday morning with a bag, a change of clothes, and his thermos. He sat on the ground outside the acclimation enclosure at 7:15. There was no bench. He sat on the grass 3 meters from the mesh and poured his coffee into the lid of the thermos and looked out at the Bridger Range and the low morning clouds catching on the peaks. Atlas stood at the far end of the enclosure. He did not move. The second morning was the same. Ray arrived at 7:15. He poured his coffee. He looked at the mountains. Atlas stood at the far end of the enclosure and was still. On the third morning, Ray had set the thermos lid on the ground beside him and was sitting with his hands loose on his knees when Atlas moved. He walked from the far end of the enclosure to the inner fence line. He stopped at 90 centimeters. He lowered his head. Ray did not look at him. He picked up the thermos lid and drank the last of what was in it, which had gone cold, and set it back down on the ground with a small, quiet sound that the grass absorbed almost immediately. Atlas raised his head. He went to the food tray which the staff had placed near the fence line that morning, and he ate. Dr. Sandhu was watching from 30 meters away. She did not write anything for several minutes. Then she opened her notebook and wrote day 3. That was all. The 180-meter flight corridor ran along the eastern edge of the property, with the Bridger Range filling the view at the far end. The first time Atlas flew its full length. Dr. Sandhu and Joel watched him level out at 20 meters altitude, hold that height for the full corridor. Then bank and rise above the corridor, above the property fence, above the plateau, until he was a dark shape against the gray morning sky, circling once before descending. It took him 40 seconds to reach the height he had last flown at before his injury. Joel said quietly, "There he is." No one asked who he meant. Ray stayed for 2 weeks. He sat on the ground every morning at 7:15 and drank his coffee and looked at the mountains. He did not participate in the flight training sessions Dr. Sandhu and Joel ran each afternoon. He was simply there, the way he had been. Simply there in Colorado, the fixed point, the pasern, the piece of information the bird had learned to associate with something that had no clinical name. At the end of the second week, Dr. Sandhu told him Atlas was stable enough to continue without him. She said his contribution to the bird's recovery was in 15 years of practice, something she could observe but not fully explain. Ray thanked her. He stood up from the ground for the last time on a Friday morning and poured the last of his coffee and drank it standing up, looking at the mountains. Atlas was flying the corridor in the distance, a white head catching the early light. He was moving the way a bird moves when it has stopped remembering it was afraid. Ray watched until the bird landed. Then he picked up his thermos and walked to his car. He drove back to Colorado in one day, stopping once for gas and once for coffee at a diner outside of Casper, Wyoming. He sat at the counter and looked out at the parking lot. The waitress A woman about his age named Carolyn refilled his cup without being asked and said, "Long drive," he said, getting there. She nodded as if that made sense and went to take an order at the other end of the counter. He left a good tip and got back on the highway. The call from Margaret came 6 weeks later. She said the center had received a grant to expand its long-term resident and therapy animal program and needed someone to coordinate it on the ground. Not a scientific role, she explained. Being present, building routines, understanding what the animals needed that wasn't in the paperwork. The position didn't have a proper title yet. They were calling it, for the moment, Animal Companion Coordinator. She asked if he knew anyone who might be interested. Ray said he thought he might. He asked what the hours were. She said whatever time you usually show up. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he would need a proper bench out there. The one they had was getting old. Margaret said she would see what she could do. He started the following Monday. He drove 40 minutes and arrived at 7:15 with his thermos and a new pair of work gloves from the hardware store in town. The yard where Atlas had stood for 11 days held 2 new animals. Now a great horned owl recovering from a wing fracture and a red-tailed hawk that had been found grounded near a suburban park and was not yet sure what to make of humans. Ray sat on the bench. He poured his coffee. He looked at the grassland. The owl watched him from the far corner with large, unreadable eyes. The hawk stood as far from the fence as the space allowed. Ray drank his coffee and did not hurry anything. 8 months after Atlas arrived in Bozeman, Dr. Sandhu submitted a report recommending that he be transitioned to the Institute's open acclimation zone, 300 acres of managed wilderness, with access to natural hunting territory. The recommendation was approved. The transition took 4 weeks. Atlas spent the first 3 days of the 4th week perched on a tall pine at the edge of the meadow, watching the open land below him. On the 4th day, he hunted. Dr. Sandhu was monitoring from a blind 300 meters away. She watched him drop from the pine and cut across the meadow at low altitude and take a ground squirrel in a single pass. He landed in the tall grass and stood over his catch. Then he ate. She wrote it up under the heading, Self-Sustaining Behavior, First Confirmed Instance. She attached a note she had not planned to write. It said, "This one came back from somewhere I don't have a word for." She stared at the sentence for a moment, then left it in. In Bozeman, Atlas hunted 3 times in the first week and 4 times in the second. He began roosting in a section of forest at the northern edge of the acclimation zone. He was not a fully wild bird, he would likely never be. But he was an eagle who hunted again. He was an eagle who chose where to sleep. In Colorado, Ray Kowalski arrived each morning at 7:15. He sat on the new bench pine boards and a steel frame facing the grassland. He poured his coffee. He watched the sky above the property where on certain mornings wild raptors circled on thermals before moving on. The animals in the enclosures around him were learning slowly that a quiet figure at a consistent time meant nothing here requires alarm. That was enough. That was Ray had come to believe quite a lot. The thermos had his old unit's logo on the side. Most of it was scratched off now. Just the outline remained the shape of something that had once meant something specific, worn down to just the shape. He could still tell what it was. He poured his coffee, and he watched the sky, and the morning continued around him, the way mornings do,